The stagecoach rattled into Copper Ridge, just as the January sun began its descent behind the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long shadows across the frozen mud of Main Street. Sarah Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the scarred left side of her face, a habit she'd developed over the past 2 years, as if she could hide the puckered burn tissue that ran from her temple down to her jaw. Through the frost-covered window, she watched the familiar buildings of her childhood town emerge from the grey winter landscape, the mercantile, the saloon, the church with its white steeple pointing accusingly at the cold sky. She had sworn never to return. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and a young couple heading west to start a ranch, had stopped trying to make conversation with her 50 miles back. They'd seen the scars when her bonnet had slipped during a particularly rough stretch of road, and their polite interest had died as quickly as a candle in the wind. Sarah had simply pulled her bonnet lower and turned her face toward the window, watching Montana Territory roll past in shades of white and grey. The coach lurched to a stop outside the Copper Ridge Hotel, and the driver's gruff voice called down that they'd arrived. Sarah waited until the other passengers had disembarked, before gathering her single worn carpet bag and stepping down into the biting cold. The wind cut through her threadbare coat immediately, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Sarah? Sarah Whitmore? Is that you?" She turned to see Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, standing outside the mercantile with a basket of supplies. Martha's eyes widened as they traveled from Sarah's face down to her shabby clothes and back up again. The woman's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like pity, mixed with revulsion. "It is you," Martha said, her voice dropping to that particular tone women used when discussing tragedy. "We heard you were living in Miles City, working as a laundress, wasn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied quietly, keeping her scarred side turned away. "I've come back to see to some family business. Your grandmother, I suppose." Martha's voice carried across the street, and Sarah noticed several people stopping their activities to stare. Poor woman, at her age, having to take in her widowed granddaughter. And after what happened to Thomas, she trailed off, shaking her head. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame in her chest. Thomas, her husband, dead 2 years now, killed in a Lakota raid on their homestead 20 miles north of here. The same raid that had set their cabin ablaze with Sarah inside, leaving her with scars that ensured she'd never forget that terrible night. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Henderson, I need to get to my grandmother's house before dark." Sarah turned and began walking down Main Street, her boots crunching in the frozen mud. She could feel eyes on her from every window, every doorway. The whispers started immediately. She could hear them even over the wind. "That's Thomas Whitmore's widow. Dear Lord, look at her face. Such a shame. She was pretty once. Indians did that to her, you know." The walk to her grandmother's house on the eastern edge of town felt like miles instead of blocks. The small clapboard structure sat alone at the end of a dirt road, separated from the other houses by an empty lot overgrown with dead grass and sagebrush. Smoke rose from the chimney and Sarah's heart sank. She'd hoped, foolishly she now realized, that perhaps her grandmother had softened in the 2 years since Sarah had left. She knocked on the door, her knuckles numb from the cold. "It's open," came the sharp voice from inside. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped into the dim interior. The house smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Her grandmother, Constance Whitmore, sat in her rocking chair by the fire, a Bible open in her lap. At 73, the old woman was still straight-backed and severe, her grey hair pulled into a tight bun, her mouth set in a perpetual line of disapproval. "So you've come back," Constance said without looking up from her Bible. "I suppose Miles City finally had enough of you." "Hello, grandmother," Sarah said, setting her carpet bag down by the door. "I received your letter saying you needed help with—" "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." Constance finally looked up, her pale blue eyes scanning Sarah with the same expression Martha Henderson had worn, that mixture of pity and distaste. "Good Lord, girl, you look worse than when you left. Have you been eating at all?" Sarah closed the door and removed her bonnet, no longer trying to hide her face. What was the point? "I eat enough." Constance returned to her Bible. "There's stew in the pot. Not much, but I suppose it'll keep you alive. You'll be sleeping in the back room. I cleared out some space, though the Lord knows it wasn't easy at my age." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, moving toward the small kitchen area. "Don't thank me. You're family, even if you are." Constance trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Even if you are damaged, ruined, unmarriageable." Sarah ladled some thin stew into a bowl and sat at the small table, eating in silence while her grandmother read scripture aloud in that sharp, judgmental voice. The fire crackled, and outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house. "I've been thinking," Constance said suddenly, closing her Bible with a snap. "About your situation." Sarah looked up warily. "You're 26 years old, a widow, scarred." Her grandmother ticked off each point, as if she were listing debts. "You have no property, no money, no prospects. You can't live off my charity forever. I won't be around much longer, and you'll be alone." "I can work," Sarah said. "I can take in laundry, mending. You can barely earn enough to feed yourself, let alone save anything." Constance leaned forward, her eyes hard. "Face the truth, Sarah. You're ugly now. No man will want you. No decent man, anyway. You'll never marry again." The words hit like physical blows, but Sarah had heard variations of them so many times they'd almost lost their sting. Almost. "I know," she said quietly. "Do you?" Constance sat back, her expression softening slightly, though on her, softness still looked like stone. "Then you understand that you need to be practical. Accept your lot. Make yourself useful where you can. Don't go filling your head with foolish notions about love or happiness. That part of your life is over." Sarah set down her spoon, her appetite gone. "Yes, grandmother." "Good. Now there's a basket of mending in the back room. Mrs. Henderson brought it by yesterday. You can start on that tomorrow. The work will keep you busy. Keep your mind from wandering to things that can't be." Sarah nodded and rose, carrying her bowl to the wash basin. Through the small kitchen window, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the town, beyond the mountains, were the Lakota camps. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd tried to build, of the night everything had burned. "Sarah," her grandmother said, as she headed toward the back room, "I don't say these things to be cruel. I say them because someone needs to tell you the truth. The sooner you accept what you are now, the easier your life will be." "Yes, grandmother," Sarah repeated, and disappeared into the small, cold room that would be her home. She sat on the narrow bed in the darkness, not bothering to light a candle. Through the thin walls, she could hear her grandmother moving about, preparing for bed. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and touched the scarred side of her face, tracing the familiar ridges and valleys of damaged skin. Ugly, unmarriageable, alone. Perhaps her grandmother was right. Perhaps it was better to accept the truth and stop hoping for anything different. Hope, after all, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Outside, the wind howled louder, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to the frozen moon. Sarah lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and pulled the thin blanket over herself. Tomorrow she would begin her new life, if it could be called a life, in Copper Ridge. Tomorrow she would become what everyone expected her to be, invisible, useful, and grateful for whatever scraps of existence came her way. But tonight, in the darkness, she allowed herself one small rebellion. She closed her eyes and remembered what it felt like to be loved, to be seen as beautiful, to be wanted. She remembered Thomas's hands on her face, both sides of her face, and the way he'd looked at her on their wedding day. Then she opened her eyes, and the memory faded into the cold reality of the darkroom. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it all the harsh truths her grandmother had spoken. But for these few moments, alone in the darkness, Sarah Whitmore allowed herself to grieve not just for what she'd lost, but for what she'd been told she could never have again. The wind rattled the window frame, and Sarah pulled the blanket higher, closing her eyes against the cold and the darkness and the cruel certainty of her future. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Sarah made her way down Main Street toward the Mercantile, a basket of mended clothes balanced on her hip. 3 days had passed since her return to Copper Ridge, and she'd quickly fallen into a routine. Wake before dawn, help her grandmother with breakfast, spend the day mending and washing clothes for the town's more prosperous families, return home after dark. It was a grey existence, but it was existence nonetheless. The February cold bit at her exposed skin as she walked, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She kept her head down, her bonnet pulled low, though she knew it was futile. Everyone in town knew who she was by now, and the whispers followed her everywhere like shadows. As she approached the Mercantile, a commotion near the sheriff's office caught her attention. A group of men had gathered outside, ranchers and townsmen by the look of them, their voices raised in heated discussion. Sarah tried to slip past unnoticed, but the crowd blocked most of the boardwalk. "I don't care what the territorial government says," bellowed Frank Morrison, who owned the largest cattle ranch in the area. "We don't need some half-breed lawman telling us how to handle Indian trouble." Sarah's steps slowed despite herself. "Morrison's right," another man chimed in. "What kind of sheriff sides with savages over his own people?" "He ain't our people," someone else muttered. "His mother was Cheyenne. That makes him one of them." The crowd murmured agreement, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard rumors at her grandmother's house that a new sheriff had been appointed, but she hadn't paid much attention. Now, curiosity got the better of her caution, and she found herself moving closer to the edge of the crowd. The door to the sheriff's office opened, and a man stepped out onto the boardwalk. Sarah's breath caught. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn leather coat. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his black hair worn longer than most white men's, touching his collar. High cheekbones and a strong jaw spoke to his Cheyenne heritage, but his eyes, a striking gray blue, suggested his white father. He wore a sheriff's star pinned to his vest, and a Colt revolver sat on each hip. But it was his expression that struck Sarah most. He looked at the angry crowd with neither fear nor aggression, just a calm, measured assessment that suggested he'd faced worse than angry words. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I understand your concerns, but I'm here to enforce the law fairly for everyone in this territory, settler and Lakota alike." "That's the problem right there," Morrison spat. "Those Indians killed settlers just last month over by the Muscle Shell, murdered a whole family. And you want to treat them fair?" The sheriff's jaw tightened slightly. "I want to find out what happened and bring whoever's responsible to justice. That's my job." "Your job is to protect white folks," another man shouted. "Not make excuses for your mother's people." Sarah saw something flicker in the sheriff's eyes, pain perhaps, or anger carefully controlled. He stepped down from the boardwalk, moving with a fluid grace that reminded her of the Lakota warriors she'd seen from a distance. "My mother's people," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the crowd, "were peaceful Cheyenne who were massacred at Sand Creek when I was 10 years old. My father was a cavalry officer who died trying to protect them. So don't presume to tell me which side I'm on. I'm on the side of the law." The crowd fell silent for a moment, and Sarah found herself unable to look away from the sheriff's face. There was strength there, and sorrow, and a determination that seemed unshakable. Morrison broke the silence. "Pretty speech, but when those Lakota come raiding again, we'll see whose side you're really on." He turned to the other men. "Come on, we're wasting our time here." The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves. Sarah realized she was standing alone now, visible to anyone who cared to look. She quickly turned to hurry away, but her boot caught on an uneven board, and she stumbled. The basket of clothes tumbled from her grip, spilling mended shirts and dresses across the frozen mud. "Ma'am, let me help you." She looked up to find the sheriff approaching, already bending to retrieve the scattered garments. Heat flooded her face. The unmarred side flushed red with embarrassment, while the scarred side remained pale and numb. "No, please, I can manage," she said quickly, trying to gather the clothes before he could get too close, before he could see her clearly. But he was already there, picking up a child's dress and brushing the mud from it carefully. "It's no trouble," he said, and then he looked at her directly. Sarah waited for it, the slight widening of the eyes, the involuntary recoil, the quick averting of gaze that she'd come to expect whenever someone saw her scars for the first time. She turned her head slightly, offering him her unmarred profile, an instinct born of 2 years of shame. The sheriff handed her the dress, his grey-blue eyes meeting hers steadily. "You're Sarah Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered, surprised he knew her name. "I'm James Thornton, the new sheriff." He continued gathering clothes, seemingly unbothered by her appearance. "I heard about what happened to you and your husband. I'm sorry for your loss." His words were simple, direct, without the cloying pity or morbid curiosity she usually encountered. Sarah found herself looking at him more closely, trying to understand this strange man who showed no reaction to her disfigurement. "Thank you," she managed, accepting more garments from him. "That was 2 years ago." "Grief doesn't follow a schedule," he said, retrieving the last shirt from near the water trough. "I lost my parents 20 years ago, and some days it still feels fresh." They stood together on the street, the basket now full again, an awkward silence stretching between them. Sarah knew she should leave, should hurry away before more townspeople saw her talking to the half-breed sheriff. It would only give them more to gossip about. But something held her there. Perhaps the novelty of being treated like a normal person, or perhaps the quiet sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. "The clothes," she finally said. "I should get them to Mrs. Henderson." "Of course." He stepped back, giving her space. "It was good to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and hurried away down the street. Behind her, she heard him return to his office, the door closing with a soft click. Her hands were shaking as she knocked on the Hendersons' door. Martha answered, took the basket with barely a word of thanks, and shut the door quickly, as if Sarah carried some contagious disease. Sarah stood on the porch for a moment, her heart still beating faster than it should. He hadn't looked away. The sheriff, James Thornton, had looked directly at her scarred face and hadn't flinched, hadn't pitied her, hadn't treated her as less than human. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt monumental. "Sarah Whitmore, what are you doing standing in the street talking to that half-breed?" She turned to find her grandmother approaching, a shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders, her face pinched with cold and disapproval. "I dropped my basket, grandmother. He was helping me pick up the clothes. I saw the whole thing from the mercantile window." Constance grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the Henderson house. "I won't have people saying my granddaughter is consorting with that man. Bad enough you're scarred and widowed. I won't have you making things worse by associating with a half-breed lawman who probably sympathizes with the very savages who killed your husband." "He was just being kind," Sarah protested weakly. "Kind?" Constance's laugh was bitter. "Men like that aren't kind, Sarah. They have their own agendas. And you, looking like you do, desperate as you are, you're exactly the type of woman a man like that might try to take advantage of." The words stung, because Sarah knew what her grandmother was implying, that she was so undesirable that only a man of mixed heritage, already rejected by white society, would show her any attention. And even that attention must have some ulterior, shameful motive. "I wasn't," Sarah began, but her grandmother cut her off. "I know what you weren't doing, but I also know how things look. You'll stay away from Sheriff Thornton, do you understand? You have little enough reputation as it is." They walked back to the small house in silence, Sarah's earlier moment of human connection already tarnishing under her grandmother's harsh judgment. But that evening, as she sat mending clothes by candlelight while Constance read her Bible, Sarah found her thoughts returning to the sheriff's face. He'd looked at her like she was a person, not a tragedy, not a cautionary tale, not an object of pity or revulsion, just a person who'd dropped her basket and needed help. It was such a simple thing, and it had been so long since anyone had offered her that basic dignity. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Sarah heard wolves howling in the distance, or perhaps they were dogs from the Lakota encampment north of town. The sound made her shiver, bringing back memories of that terrible night 2 years ago. Fire and screams and the smell of burning wood and flesh. "Sarah," her grandmother said sharply, "you're staring into space. Finish that mending so we can get to bed." "Yes, grandmother." Sarah bent back to her work, but her mind wandered. She thought about James Thornton standing on that boardwalk, facing down an angry crowd with quiet dignity. She thought about his words, "I'm on the side of the law." She thought about the sadness in his eyes when he'd mentioned his parents. And she thought about how it felt to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in 2 years. It was dangerous to think such thoughts, she knew. Her grandmother was right. Sarah had no business entertaining any notions about the sheriff or any other man. She was ugly now, damaged, fit only for the shadows and the work that no one else wanted to do. But as she snuffed out the candle that night and lay in her narrow bed, Sarah allowed herself one small rebellion. She remembered the way Sheriff Thornton had looked at her, steady and kind and unflinching. She held on to that memory like a candle flame in the darkness, knowing it would have to sustain her through the long, cold nights ahead, because tomorrow would bring the same harsh reality, the same whispers and cruel looks, the same grinding poverty and loneliness. But for tonight she had this, the memory of being treated like a human being by a man who understood what it meant to be judged for circumstances beyond one's control. It wasn't much, but in Sarah's narrow, constrained life, it felt like everything. 2 weeks passed before Sarah saw Sheriff Thornton again. February gave way to March, but winter still gripped Copper Ridge with icy fingers. Sarah's days blurred together in a monotonous pattern of washing, mending and enduring her grandmother's sharp tongue and the town's cold shoulders. Then came the morning that changed everything. Sarah was at the creek behind the livery stable, kneeling on the frozen bank to wash a load of linens. The water was so cold it made her hands ache, but she'd learned to work through the pain. She was so focused on scrubbing a stubborn stain that she didn't hear the approaching horses until they were nearly upon her. She looked up to see 3 Lakota warriors on the opposite bank, their ponies drinking from the creek. Sarah's heart seized in her chest. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as memories flooded back. Fire, screams, Thomas's body lying in the dirt. One of the warriors noticed her and said something to his companions. They all turned to look at her, their expressions unreadable. Sarah scrambled backward, abandoning her washing, her boots slipping on the icy bank. She fell hard, her hip striking a rock, but fear drove her to her feet again. "Please," she whispered, though they were too far away to hear. "Please don't." The warriors made no move toward her. They simply watched as she gathered her skirts and ran, stumbling through the snow back toward town. She could hear her own ragged breathing, feel her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time she reached Main Street, she was shaking so badly she could barely stand. "Mrs. Whitmore!" She spun around to find Sheriff Thornton standing outside the telegraph office, concern etched on his face. Without thinking, Sarah lurched toward him, the only person in sight who'd shown her any kindness. "Indians!" she gasped. "By the creek, 3 of them." His hand went to his revolver, but his voice remained calm. "Did they threaten you?" No, but they looked at me and I—" Sarah realized how hysterical she sounded. "I'm sorry, It's all right," James said gently. He guided her to the bench outside the telegraph office. "Sit down. Catch your breath." Sarah collapsed onto the bench, her whole body trembling. She was dimly aware that people were stopping to stare, but she couldn't seem to control her shaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, look at me." James crouched in front of her, his grey-blue eyes steady and calm. "You're safe. I need you to breathe slowly. Can you do that?" She tried, drawing in a shuddering breath, then another. Gradually the panic began to recede, though her hands still shook. "Those warriors," James said quietly, "were probably from Red Cloud's band. They have permission to hunt on this side of the creek as part of the treaty. They wouldn't have harmed you." "You don't know that," Sarah whispered. "You weren't there when—" She stopped, unable to finish. Understanding crossed James's face. "When your husband was killed." She nodded, pressing her trembling hands together. "Sarah." He used her first name without seeming to realize it. "What happened to you and your husband was terrible, but those warriors by the creek weren't the same men who attacked your homestead. Most Lakota are trying to live peacefully, to survive on land that's being taken from them piece by piece. They killed Thomas," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "They burned our home. They did this to me." She gestured to her scarred face. James was quiet for a moment. "I know," he finally said, "and I'm not asking you to forgive that. But I'm asking you to understand that judging all Lakota by the actions of a few warriors is like judging all white people by the actions of the men who massacred my mother's village." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of carrying 2 worlds that hated each other. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about your mother, your family, and I'm sorry about yours." He stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, let me walk you home." "No." Sarah rose on her own, aware of the eyes watching them from windows and doorways. "I can manage, thank you, Sheriff." She hurried away before he could protest, before the townspeople could add Indian sympathizer to her list of faults. But she felt his gaze on her back all the way down the street. That evening, as Sarah prepared supper, her grandmother set down her Bible with an emphatic thump. "I heard you caused quite a scene in town today," Constance said. "Crying and carrying on, throwing yourself at that half-breed sheriff." "I wasn't throwing myself at anyone," Sarah replied, stirring the thin soup. "I was frightened, and he helped me." "You were making a spectacle." Again, Constance's voice was sharp as a knife. "First you're talking to him in the street. Now you're seeking him out. People are beginning to talk, Sarah. Let them talk. They talk about me anyway. Don't you sass me, girl." Her grandmother stood, moving closer. "You may think you have nothing left to lose, but you do. You have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and what little respect your family name still commands. Keep associating with that man, and you'll lose even that." Sarah set down the spoon, fighting to keep her voice level. "He's the sheriff, grandmother. He's supposed to help people. That's all he was doing." "Is it?" Constance's eyes narrowed. "Or are you developing foolish notions? Because I warned you, Sarah. You're ugly now, you'll never marry again. And certainly not to a man like him, even if he were interested, which I doubt he is. He was probably just being polite." The words landed like physical blows, but Sarah had heard them so many times they almost didn't hurt anymore. Almost. "I know what I am," Sarah said quietly. "Do you? Then act like it. Keep your head down, do your work, and stop drawing attention to yourself." Constance returned to her chair. "Now serve the soup before it gets cold." That night, Sarah lay awake long after her grandmother's snoring began in the next room. She thought about the Lakota warriors by the creek and the terror that had gripped her. She thought about James's words, "Judging all Lakota by the actions of a few warriors is like judging all white people by the actions of the men who massacred my mother's village." She'd never thought about it that way before. She'd been so consumed by her own pain, her own loss, that she'd never considered that the Lakota might have their own grievances, their own losses, that they might see the white settlers the same way she saw them, as invaders, as murderers, as the enemy. It was a troubling thought. It made the world more complicated than she wanted it to be. 3 days later, Sarah was leaving the mercantile when she nearly collided with James on the boardwalk. He stepped aside quickly, touching his hat. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Sheriff?" She moved to pass him, but he spoke again. "How are you doing? After the other day, I mean." Sarah paused, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. "I'm fine, thank you." "Good." He hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about what happened. If you'd like, I could teach you some ways to stay safe if you encounter Lakota hunters again. Simple things. How to show you're not a threat. How to retreat without causing alarm." Sarah stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're afraid and knowledge is better than fear." He shrugged. "And because it's my job to keep everyone in this town safe, including you. My grandmother wouldn't approve." "I'm not asking your grandmother. I'm asking you." His grey-blue eyes held hers steadily. "But if you're not interested, that's fine. The offer stands if you change your mind." He touched his hat again and walked away, leaving Sarah standing on the boardwalk, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She should say no. She should follow her grandmother's advice and stay away from James Thornton. Getting close to him, even for something as practical as learning to stay safe, would only lead to pain. He was offering her friendship, perhaps, or at least professional courtesy. But her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "You're ugly now. You'll never marry again." She couldn't afford to misinterpret his kindness as something more. But that evening, as she mended clothes by candlelight, Sarah found herself thinking about his offer. Not because she harbored any romantic notions, she'd crushed those down long ago, but because he was right. Knowledge was better than fear, and living in terror every time she saw a Lakota hunter was no way to exist. 2 days later, Sarah waited until her grandmother was napping, then walked to the sheriff's office. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door, half hoping he wouldn't be there. James opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to take you up on your offer," Sarah said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. "About learning to stay safe if it's still available." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it. "It is. Come in." She hesitated at the threshold. Going into the sheriff's office alone would definitely fuel gossip. But then she thought about the terror she'd felt by the creek, and she stepped inside. The office was sparse but clean. A desk, a few chairs, a gun rack on the wall, and a small stove that filled the room with welcome heat. James gestured to a chair. "First thing to understand," he said, sitting behind his desk, "is that most Lakota warriors have no interest in harming civilians. They're hunters, trying to feed their families. The raids that happen, like the one that killed your husband, those are usually retaliation for broken promises or attacks on their camps." "That doesn't make it right," Sarah said. "No, it doesn't. But understanding the why helps you respond appropriately." He leaned forward. "When you see Lakota hunters, the most important thing is to stay calm. Running triggers a chase instinct. Instead, stand still or back away slowly. Don't make sudden movements." "I ran," Sarah whispered. "I know. That's natural when you're afraid, but now you'll know better." He continued, explaining basic Lakota hand signs for peace, how to position herself to appear non-threatening, what to do if approached. Sarah listened, asking questions, gradually relaxing in the warm office. James was patient, repeating things when she didn't understand, never making her feel foolish for her fear. An hour passed before she realized it. The sun was getting lower, and she needed to get home before her grandmother woke from her nap. "Thank you," Sarah said, standing. "This was helpful." "Come back any time you have questions," James said, "or if you just want to talk. I know what it's like to feel alone in this town." Their eyes met, and for a moment Sarah saw past the sheriff's badge and the mixed heritage and the careful composure. She saw a man who was as lonely as she was, who carried his own scars even if they weren't visible on his face. "I should go," she said softly. He nodded, walking her to the door. As Sarah stepped out into the cold afternoon, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. Not for romance or love, she knew better than that, but hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could have a friend, someone who understood what it meant to be judged, to be cast out, to be seen as less than human because of things beyond their control. It was a dangerous hope. But as Sarah walked home through the gathering dusk, she couldn't quite bring herself to crush it down. Not yet. March brought unseasonable warmth to Copper Ridge, melting the snow and turning the streets into rivers of mud. With the thaw came increased tension. Lakota hunting parties ventured closer to town. Settlers grew more nervous, and Sheriff Thornton found himself mediating disputes almost daily. Sarah saw him often now, though always briefly and in public places. A nod on the street, a word of greeting outside the mercantile, once a brief conversation about the weather. Nothing improper, nothing that should have drawn attention. But in a town like Copper Ridge, even the smallest interactions between the scarred widow and the half-breed sheriff became fodder for gossip. "People are talking," Martha Henderson said one afternoon when Sarah delivered her mended clothes. The banker's wife stood in her doorway, blocking Sarah's entrance. "About you and that sheriff. We're barely acquaintances," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. "Then why is he watching you whenever you're in town?" Martha's eyes glittered with malicious curiosity. "Why did Lucy Morrison see you leaving his office 3 weeks ago?" "He was teaching me safety precautions. After I encountered Lakota hunters by the creek." "Safety precautions." Martha's tone made it sound like something shameful. "Sarah, I knew your mother, God rest her soul. She'd be heartbroken to see what you've become. First you marry a man who drags you out to the wilderness where savages kill him and disfigure you, and now you're consorting with a half-breed who—" Sarah turned and walked away, Martha's voice calling after her. Her hands shook as she hurried down the muddy street, shame and anger burning in her chest. She knew she should be used to such treatment by now, but it still hurt. It always hurt. She didn't realize where her feet were taking her until she found herself outside the sheriff's office. Through the window she could see James at his desk, writing something in a ledger. She should leave. Going in would only confirm what people like Martha Henderson already believed, but she was so tired of being alone. Sarah knocked before she could change her mind. James looked up. Surprise and something else. Pleasure, perhaps, crossing his face as he recognized her. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Come in." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The office was warm and the smell of coffee filled the air. "I shouldn't be here," Sarah said. "People are talking about us." James set down his pen. "Let them talk. They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough. You don't understand. For you, it's just gossip. For me, it's my entire existence in this town." Sarah pulled off her bonnet, no longer caring if he saw her scars clearly. "I have nothing, Sheriff Thornton. No money, no home of my own, no prospects. All I have is the grudging charity of my grandmother, and whatever scraps of work the town women throw my way. If they decide I'm too scandalous to associate with, then they're fools." James stood, moving around his desk. "Sarah, you're one of the hardest-working, most dignified people I've met in this town. If they can't see that past your scars or their own prejudices, that's their failing, not yours." The use of her first name, the genuine anger on her behalf, it was too much. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since the night Thomas died. "You don't understand what it's like," she whispered. "Don't I?" James's voice was quiet but intense. "I'm the half-breed sheriff who nobody wanted. The ranchers think I favor the Lakota think I favor the whites, and both sides wish I'd disappear. I eat alone, I sleep alone, and the only people who talk to me are those who want something or want to tell me how poorly I'm doing my job." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the weight of trying to bridge two worlds that refused to meet. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're right, you do understand." They stood in silence for a moment, the office feeling smaller suddenly, more intimate. Sarah became aware of how close they were standing, of the way James was looking at her, not at her scars but at her, Sarah, the person beneath. "I should go," she said, but she didn't move. "Sarah." James reached out, then stopped, his hand falling back to his side. "Would you like some coffee? It's terrible. I make it too strong, but it's hot." She should say no. She should leave immediately and never come back. But instead, Sarah heard herself say, "Yes, thank you." They sat on opposite sides of his desk, drinking bitter coffee and talking about nothing important, the muddy streets, the early thaw, the general store's shipment of supplies that had been delayed. It was ordinary, pleasant, normal. For half an hour, Sarah forgot she was the ugly widow, and James forgot he was the unwanted sheriff, and they were just two lonely people, grateful for company. "I should really go," Sarah finally said, setting down her empty cup. "My grandmother will wonder where I am." "Of course." James walked her to the door. "Sarah, if you need anything at all, you can come to me. I know we barely know each other, but I'd like to think we're friends." Friends. Such a simple word, but it felt like a gift. "I'd like that too," Sarah said softly. She left before she could say anything more, hurrying through the muddy streets as the afternoon shadows grew longer. But for the first time since returning to Copper Ridge, Sarah felt less alone. That fragile peace shattered 3 days later. Sarah was at the creek again, this time with another woman from town, when the screaming started. They looked up to see smoke rising from the direction of Frank Morrison's ranch, 5 miles north of town. Within minutes, the church bell was ringing the alarm, and men were mounting horses, grabbing rifles. "Indians!" someone shouted. "They're raiding Morrison's place." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She abandoned her washing and ran toward town, her heart pounding. By the time she reached Main Street, a mob had formed outside the sheriff's office. Frank Morrison was there, his face red with rage, blood staining his shirt. "They killed 3 of my men," Morrison roared, "burned my barn, ran off with 20 head of cattle. And where were you, Sheriff? Probably warning your Indian friends we were coming." James stood on the boardwalk, his face calm but his hand resting on his revolver. "I was in town, Morrison. I just heard about the attack." "Convenient." Morrison spat in the mud. "I'm forming a posse. We're going after them, and we're going to make them pay, every last one of them." "You'll do no such thing without my authority," James said firmly. "If there's been a raid, I'll investigate and track down those responsible, but I won't have vigilante justice in my territory." "Your territory?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "You mean the territory you're supposed to protect? While white men die, you sit here protecting the very savages who killed them." The crowd murmured agreement. Sarah pushed through to the front, her fear momentarily forgotten in her concern for James. She could see the situation turning dangerous. "The law applies to everyone," James said, his voice steady despite the anger directed at him. "If you form a vigilante posse and attack the Lakota camp, you'll be the ones breaking the law, and I will arrest you." "You and what army?" someone shouted from the crowd. Morrison stepped closer to the boardwalk. "Here's what's going to happen, Sheriff. You're going to step aside, and we're going to handle this our way, the white man's way, and if you try to stop us, we'll go through you." James's hand moved to his revolver. "I don't want this to turn violent, Morrison, but I took an oath to uphold the law, and I intend to do that, even if it means protecting Indian killers over your own people." Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. "Oh, that's right. They're your people, aren't they? Your mother was one of them." Sarah saw James's jaw tighten, saw the pain flash across his face. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "Sheriff Thornton is trying to prevent more bloodshed. If you attack that camp, innocent people will die. Women, children, just like your men died today." Morrison turned his contemptuous gaze on her. "Well, if it isn't Thomas Whitmore's widow, the one who got her face burned off by Indians, and here you are defending them. Your husband would be ashamed." The words hit like a physical blow, but Sarah forced herself to stay upright. "My husband would want justice, not massacre. There's a difference." "You're a fool," Morrison said, "both of you." He turned to the crowd. "Who's with me?" About 20 men stepped forward. James's hand tightened on his revolver, and Sarah's heart raced. This was going to end in violence, she could feel it. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "You men will disperse, now." Everyone turned to see Reverend Matthews standing at the edge of the crowd, his Bible in hand. The elderly minister might have been frail, but his voice carried authority. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your anger, but Sheriff Thornton is right. Vigilante justice is not God's justice. If you attack that Lakota camp, you'll be committing murder, and I will not stand by and watch this town descend into lawlessness." "Reverend, they killed," Morrison began, "and the sheriff will investigate and bring the guilty parties to justice. That is how civilized people behave." Matthews moved through the crowd, which parted for him. "Go home, all of you. Let the law handle this." For a long moment, the crowd wavered. Then, slowly, men began to lower their rifles to turn away. Morrison glared at James, then at Sarah, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he said. "Next time Indians attack, the blood will be on your hands." He stormed off, half the crowd following him. The rest dispersed gradually, leaving James, Sarah, and Reverend Matthews standing in the muddy street. "Thank you, Reverend," James said quietly. "Don't thank me, son. I just prevented a massacre today. But Morrison's right about one thing. It's not over." The old minister looked between James and Sarah. "You two should be careful. You're both making yourselves targets." He walked away, leaving them alone. Sarah realized she was shaking, the adrenaline draining from her body. "You shouldn't have spoken up," James said softly. "You put yourself in danger." "So did you every day." Sarah met his eyes. "Someone had to stand with you." Something shifted between them in that moment, something unspoken but profound. James took a step toward her, then stopped himself. "Sarah, He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I want you to stay safe. If Morrison or his men cause you trouble because of what happened today, I can handle it," Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. "I know you can, but you shouldn't have to." James's grey-blue eyes held hers. "I wish things were different. I wish this town wasn't so full of hatred and fear. I wish—" He stopped, but Sarah understood what he couldn't say. "I wish we could be more than this. I wish we weren't both outcasts. I wish we had a chance." "I should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them, full of everything they couldn't have, everything the world wouldn't allow. Finally, Sarah forced herself to turn away. She walked home through the muddy streets, aware that everything had changed. She'd taken a stand, she'd chosen a side, and there would be consequences. Her grandmother was waiting at the door, her face pale with fury. Inside, now. Sarah followed her into the house, bracing herself for the storm she knew was coming. "You stood up for that half-breed," Constance said, her voice shaking, "in front of the entire town. You defended Indians, the same Indians who killed your husband and scarred you for life. Have you lost your mind?" "I defended justice," Sarah said quietly. "Justice?" Constance's laugh was harsh. "You defended a man who cares more about savages than his own people, a man who's made you the subject of scandal, and now you've made yourself a target. Morrison's men will remember what you said today." "Then let them remember," Sarah said, surprising herself with her own conviction. "I'm tired of being afraid all the time, tired of hiding, tired of letting fear rule my life." Her grandmother stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "What's happened to you?" Sarah thought about James standing alone on that boardwalk, ready to face down 20 armed men to uphold the law. She thought about his kindness, his loneliness, his quiet strength. "I found a friend," she said simply. "Someone who sees me as a person, not a tragedy. A friend." Constance's voice was heavy with disdain. "Is that what you're calling it? Because I see the way you look at him, Sarah, and I see the way he looks at you. You're developing feelings for that man. And if I am—" The words were out before Sarah could stop them. "Then you're a fool." Her grandmother sat down heavily, suddenly looking all of her 73 years. "He's a half-breed sheriff in a town that hates him. You're a scarred widow with nothing to your name. Even if he returned your feelings, which I doubt he does, what kind of life could you possibly have together?" Sarah had no answer, because her grandmother was right. Even if James felt something for her, and she wasn't sure he did, what future could they possibly have? They were both outcasts, both surviving on the margins of a society that had rejected them. But for the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt alive. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like Sarah Whitmore, not just the ugly widow or the scarred victim, and she wasn't sure she could give that up, even if keeping it meant facing the town's hatred alone. "I'm going to bed," Sarah said, moving toward her small room. "You're making a terrible mistake," her grandmother called after her. Maybe she was. But as Sarah lay in her narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't bring herself to regret defending James. She couldn't bring herself to regret being seen, being valued, being treated as an equal by someone who understood what it meant to be cast out. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Morrison and his men would remember. The town would judge her even more harshly. Her grandmother would continue her dire warnings. But tonight Sarah held on to the memory of standing beside James Thornton, of choosing courage over fear, of finally stepping out of the shadows she'd been hiding in for 2 years. It was dangerous, it was probably foolish, but it was also the most alive she'd felt since the night her world burned down around her, and for now, that was enough. The consequences came swiftly. Within 2 days of Sarah's public defense of Sheriff Thornton, 3 families cancelled their laundry orders. Martha Henderson refused to open her door when Sarah came to deliver mended clothes. Even the mercantile owner, old Mr. Talbot, who'd always been kind, looked away when Sarah entered his store. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, wrapping her meager purchases in brown paper, "but folks are saying you're an Indian sympathizer now. My business. I can't afford to be associated with that." Sarah took her package without responding. What could she say? She'd known this would happen. She'd chosen it, in a way, when she'd stood beside James in front of that angry mob. Her grandmother barely spoke to her now, communicating only in sharp-clipped sentences when necessary. The silence in the small house was oppressive, broken only by the sound of Constance's Bible pages turning and her disapproving sighs. On the fourth day, Sarah counted what little money she had left, $3.47. Without work, it would last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. After that, she didn't know what would happen after that. She was mending one of her own dresses when the knock came at the door. Her grandmother was at the church, attending a women's prayer circle that Sarah was no longer welcome to join. Sarah set aside her sewing and opened the door to find James Thornton standing on her porch, his hat in his hands. "Sheriff," she said, startled, "you shouldn't be here. If anyone sees—" "I know, but I needed to talk to you." He glanced down the empty street. "May I come in? Just for a moment." Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside. James entered, seeming to fill the small room with his presence. He looked tired, she noticed. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and tension lined his face. "I heard what's been happening," he said without preamble. "The cancelled orders, people refusing your business. It's nothing I can't handle." "Sarah." He said her name with such gentle concern that she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "You're losing your livelihood because you stood up for me. That's not nothing." "I stood up for what was right," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" James moved closer, and Sarah caught the scent of leather and sage. "Because from where I'm standing, you sacrificed everything to defend someone this town hates, and I won't let you suffer for that." "What are you suggesting?" He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "There's a town 3 territories over Carson City. They're looking for someone to run their laundry and mending service. It's steady work, decent pay, and nobody there knows about your past, about the scars, or any of this." Sarah stared at the envelope. "Who you want me to leave? I want you to have a chance at a real life." James's voice was rough with emotion. "Here, you'll always be the scarred widow who sided with the half-breed sheriff. But there, you could start over. Be whoever you want to be." She took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter of introduction and enough money for stagecoach fare and a month's lodging. It was a fortune to her, and probably everything James had. "I can't accept this," Sarah whispered. "You have to. Sarah, you're starving yourself. Your grandmother treats you like a burden. This town has made you invisible except when they want to judge you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You deserve better." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what he wasn't saying. The loneliness in his eyes, the careful way he kept distance between them, the resignation in his voice. He was sending her away because he cared about her, because he knew she had no future in Copper Ridge. "And what about you?" she asked. "What kind of life do you have here? That's not your concern, isn't it?" Sarah set the envelope on the table. "You stand alone every day against this town's hatred. You try to keep peace between people who want war. You have no friends, no allies, no one to—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "No one to what?" James asked softly. "No one to care if you live or die," Sarah finished. "Just like me." The silence that fell between them was heavy with truth. They stood facing each other in that small, shabby room, 2 outcasts who'd found unexpected understanding in each other's company. "It doesn't matter what I want," James finally said, "or what you want. We both know there's no future for us. Not here. Not anywhere. I'm asking you to take this chance, Sarah. Go somewhere you can build a real life. Find someone who what? Who can look past my scars." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You're the first person in 2 years who's done that. The first person who's seen me as Sarah, not as damaged goods, or a cautionary tale, or an object of pity. Then you understand why you need to leave. Because what I feel—" He stopped abruptly, but the confession hung between them anyway. "What you feel," Sarah prompted, her heart pounding. James turned away, his shoulders tense. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Sarah moved closer, emboldened by desperation. "James, please, don't send me away without telling me the truth." He turned back, and the raw emotion in his face took her breath away. "The truth? The truth is that I think about you every moment of every day, that I've never met anyone as brave or kind or strong as you, that when you smiled at me over coffee last week, I felt less alone than I have in 20 years. He took a ragged breath. "And the truth is that I have nothing to offer you. No future, no security, no hope of acceptance. All I can give you is a life of struggle and judgment and poverty. So yes, Sarah, I'm sending you away, because I care about you too much to let you sacrifice everything for a man who can't give you the life you deserve." Sarah's eyes burned with tears. "What if I don't want a different life? What if I want this one, even with all its struggles?" "Don't," James's voice broke. "Don't say that. Don't throw away your chance at happiness for what? For you?" Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his grey-blue eyes. "James, I've been dead for 2 years, going through the motions, existing but not living. You made me feel alive again. You made me remember who I was before the world told me I was worthless. Sarah, I love you." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I know it's foolish. I know we have no future. I know I'm ugly and scarred and you could do so much better, but I love you anyway. And if you're sending me away, at least let me say it once." James stared at her, his expression a mixture of wonder and pain. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched her face, both sides of her face, with a tenderness that made her want to weep. "You're not ugly," he said hoarsely. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I love you too. God help me, I love you too." He kissed her then, gentle and desperate all at once, and Sarah felt something inside her break open. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the years of believing she was unlovable, it all crumbled away beneath the simple truth of his lips on hers. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, both had tears on their faces. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered. James rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know, but we figure it out together." The sound of a horse outside made them spring apart. Through the window, Sarah saw her grandmother dismounting from Mr. Talbot's wagon. She and James looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. "I should go," he said. "No," Sarah caught his hand. "No more hiding, no more shame. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly." James searched her face, then nodded. He was still standing in the middle of the room when Constance walked through the door. The old woman froze, her eyes moving from James to Sarah and back again. She took in their clasped hands, their tear-stained faces, the envelope of money on the table. "Get out of my house," Constance said to James, her voice like ice. "Grandmother," Sarah began. "I said get out." Constance's face had gone pale with fury. "You come into my home, corrupt my granddaughter with your lies and false promises." "He's done nothing wrong," Sarah said firmly. "We've done nothing wrong. We care about each other, and we're not going to apologize for that." "Care about each other?" Constance's laugh was shrill. "You stupid, stupid girl. Do you think love is enough? Do you think the town will suddenly accept you because you found some half-breed to take pity on you? He's not taking pity on me. He loves me. And what will you do with that love? Live in shame? Bear half-breed children that will be rejected by both whites and Indians? Watch as he's killed by Morrison's men or by Lakota warriors who see him as a traitor?" Constance turned her rage on James. "Is that what you want for her? Is that the life you're offering?" James's face had gone hard as stone. "I'm offering her honesty, respect, partnership, which is more than you've ever given her. How dare you? You've spent 2 years telling Sarah she's ugly, worthless, unlovable," James continued, his voice quiet but cutting. "You've made her believe she deserves nothing better than your contempt and this town's cruelty. But she deserves everything, and I intend to give her everything I have, even if it's not much." Constance looked between them, her expression shifting from fury to something that might have been fear. "Sarah, if you go with this man, you're no granddaughter of mine. I won't have you in this house. I won't acknowledge you. You'll be dead to me." The ultimatum hung in the air. Sarah felt the weight of it, the finality. But when she looked at James, saw the love and support in his eyes, the choice became simple. "Then I guess I'm no longer your granddaughter," Sarah said quietly. "You're throwing away your family for him?" "No, grandmother. I'm choosing the family I want instead of the one that never wanted me." Sarah squeezed James's hand. "I'll pack my things." She moved to the back room, James following. Behind them, Constance stood frozen, seemingly unable to believe what was happening. Sarah had few possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a small daguerreotype of Thomas. She packed them quickly into her carpet bag, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. "You're sure about this?" James asked quietly. "I've never been more sure of anything." They emerged from the back room to find Constance sitting in her chair, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of regret, but then she remembered the years of cruel words, of being made to feel worthless, of having her grief and pain dismissed as inconvenient. "Goodbye, grandmother," Sarah said. Constance didn't respond. James took Sarah's bag and escorted her out of the house. The afternoon sun was bright, almost blinding after the dim interior. They stood on the porch and Sarah took a deep breath of free air. "Where will we go?" she asked. "My place. It's small, but it's mine. We'll figure out the rest as we go." James looked down at her. "Sarah, this won't be easy. The town will make our lives difficult. Morrison and his men might cause trouble. Your grandmother might—" "I know." Sarah smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I know it won't be easy, but it'll be honest and it'll be ours." They walked down the street together, hand in hand, and Sarah didn't care who saw. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She'd spent 2 years trying to disappear, trying to be invisible, trying to earn back the acceptance of people who would never truly accept her. Now she was choosing to be seen, to be herself, to love and be loved without shame. The sheriff's living quarters were behind his office, 2 small rooms that were Spartan but clean. James set her bag down carefully, then turned to her with uncertainty in his eyes. "We should probably talk about— we're not married, and people will assume—" "Then we'll get married," Sarah said simply. "If you want to. If that's what you want. Of course it's what I want. But Sarah, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be the half-breed sheriff's wife. The town will—" Sarah stopped his words with a kiss. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "I'm already the scarred widow who sided with you against the town. How much worse can it get?" James laughed, and the sound was full of surprised joy. "When you put it that way. Besides," Sarah continued, moving around the small room, already imagining how to make it a home, "someone needs to teach you how to make decent coffee, and those shirts could use some mending. And I suspect your cooking is terrible." "It is," James admitted. "Truly terrible." They looked at each other, and suddenly they were both laughing, the tension and fear of the past weeks dissolving into something that felt almost like hope. "We should see the Reverend Matthews tomorrow," James said. "If he'll marry us." "He will," Sarah said with confidence. "He stood with us against the mob. He'll stand with us in this too." That evening, they sat together in James's small quarters, planning their future. It wouldn't be the life either of them had imagined. There would be struggles, prejudice, danger. Morrison and his men would remain a threat. The Lakota might see James as a traitor for marrying a white woman. The town would judge them both harshly, but they would face it together. 2 days later, Reverend Matthews married them in his small study, with only his wife as witness. Sarah wore her one good dress, mended carefully. James wore his Sunday clothes, his sheriff's star polished bright. They spoke their vows quietly but firmly, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials lay ahead. When James kissed his bride, Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. They emerged from the church to find a small crowd gathered. Sarah's heart sank, expecting hostility. But then she saw faces she recognized: Mr. Talbot from the Mercantile, Doc Wilson, a few of the ranchers who'd remained neutral during the confrontation with Morrison. "Congratulations," Mr. Talbot said gruffly. "I know I wasn't much help before, but, well, a man's got to stand for something, I suppose. You need anything for setting up house, you come see me, I'll give you fair prices." Others nodded agreement. Not everyone, certainly. Martha Henderson and her circle of ladies stood across the street, their faces pinched with disapproval. Morrison and his men were nowhere to be seen, which Sarah took as a small mercy. But there were more friendly faces than she'd expected, people who were tired of hatred, tired of division, willing to give a half-breed sheriff and a scarred widow a chance at happiness. "Thank you," James said, his arm around Sarah's waist. "Thank you all." As they walked back to their new home, Sarah saw her grandmother standing in the doorway of her house, watching. Their eyes met across the muddy street. Constance's expression was unreadable, anger perhaps, or regret, or simply the stubborn pride that had defined her life. Sarah raised her hand in a small wave. Her grandmother didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't acceptance, but it was something. Maybe with time, it could become something more. "Are you all right?" James asked softly. "I am," Sarah said, and realized it was true. For the first time in 2 years, "I'm actually all right." That night, in their small home behind the sheriff's office, Sarah and James lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Copper Ridge settling into sleep. Outside, dogs barked and horses stamped in their corrals. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "I love you," James whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Sarah replied, her scarred cheek resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The road ahead would be difficult. Morrison still posed a threat. The tension between settlers and Lakota would continue to simmer. The town would judge them, test them, try to break them apart. But tonight they had each other. They had chosen love over fear, courage over shame, hope over despair. And that, Sarah thought as sleep claimed her, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, watching as James helped resolve a dispute between a Lakota hunter and a nervous settler. He handled it with patience and fairness, ensuring both men felt heard. When they left, shaking hands awkwardly but peacefully, Sarah felt a surge of pride. Her laundry business had slowly rebuilt itself, not with the town's wealthy families, but with those who cared more about clean clothes than social standing. She and James were making ends meet, just barely, but they were making it. Some people still whispered. Morrison still glared when their paths crossed. Her grandmother still hadn't spoken to her, though Sarah sometimes saw her at church, watching from a distance. But Sarah had friends now, real friends. Doc Wilson's wife had started bringing by soup. Mr. Talbot always had a kind word. Even a few Lakota women from the nearby camp had begun bringing her mending, curious about the white woman who'd married the half-Cheyenne sheriff. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young bride, standing beside Thomas all those years ago. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted for the scarred, worthless widow her grandmother had declared unmarriageable. But it was her life, chosen freely, lived honestly, filled with love and purpose. James came out of the office and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how my grandmother said I was ugly and would never marry again," Sarah said, leaning back into his embrace. And she was wrong. Sarah turned in his arms, touching his face gently. "I'm not ugly. I'm loved. And I did marry again, to the best man I've ever known." James kissed her, gentle and sweet, right there on Main Street where anyone could see. Let them look, Sarah thought. Let them judge. Let them whisper. She'd spent too many years hiding in shadows, believing the cruel things people said about her. But James had shown her the truth, that she was worthy of love, of respect, of happiness, and together they would build a life that proved everyone wrong. The sun was setting over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah and James stood together, watching the day fade into night, knowing tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But they would face them together, and that made all the difference. The end.